I want to talk to you guys about a little history story, a story from history, American history. I rarely ever talk about American history, but I've been looking more into it during these bizarre times because it is very relevant. The future and the present sure do rhyme with the past. So it is important to look to the past for some knowledge and for some answers. I have said I've said this numerous times. History goes through cycles. We as humans go through cycles. And America is no different. America goes through cycles. We go from periods of calm to periods of radicalism and radicalization and violence. And then we go back to being calm. And then we go back to the same quagmire of chaos and violence. And there was an event that took place in American history. It took place in the year 1898. So this is after the Civil War. The after effects of the Civil War are still in the air, and it is in the late 90s of the 1800s. So the world is about to hit the 1900s. The world is about to hit the 20th century. So it's a big turning point for human history. And in the state of North Carolina, there was a city called Wilmington, and Wilmington still exists. At this time, the city of Wilmington was a majority black city. Blacks held public office, which was a pretty big step forward from what America was used to. Blacks ran businesses. From what I have read, a lot of the finance in Wilmington was, well, controlled by African Americans. The literacy rates amongst blacks in Wilmington were actually higher than those of the white population in the city. So it was a growing city, and it was a booming city. And it was a city that was a sight for sore eyes for the racist Democrat Party. The Democrats did not like what was going on in Wilmington, and the Republicans were gaining. Well, the Republicans actually had a lot of influence, and they had a lot of ground in Wilmington because in those times, American blacks voted Republican. It was I think the African American population began voting Democrat. I want to say in the time of Woodrow Wilson is when things began to go more for the Democrat side as far as the African American vote goes. But at this time, in the late 1800s, blacks supported the Republican Party. And the Democrats did not like this. They didn't like this. They didn't like the type of power that the Republicans were getting in North Carolina. So there was a conspiracy that was done by the Democrats to rile up the racists against the blacks in Wilmington. There was a paramilitary organization in North Carolina. They were called the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts were a militant political organization that was fiercely loyal to the Democrat Party. They were really a paramilitary organization for the Democrats. And there were two instigators who wanted to provoke racial strife and war in North Carolina. One of them was Furnifold Simmons. Furnifold Simmons was a former U.S. representative, and he was a Democrat racist. And then there was a guy by the name of Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels was the editor for a major newspaper in North Carolina. And there was another guy by the name of Charles Aycock. And Charles Aycock would eventually be the one of the governors of North Carolina. Charles Aycock was another racist who conspired with Simmons and Daniels. to try to push back on the Republican advancement. And because Mr. Daniels controlled a major newspaper, he had a lot of power. He had a lot of influence amongst the population. So they began to spread stories about the Africans. They began to spread stories about the blacks. They began to say, well, the blacks, they rape white women. They're violent. They're evil. They're forces of destruction. They must be stopped. And so the Democrats, they wanted to do a coup in the city of Wilmington. There was an election that was done in Wilmington, and a guy by the name of Silas P. Wright, that was his name. He was a Republican, and he would become the mayor of Wilmington. At this time, the Republicans had joined forces with a group called the Fusionists. The Fusionists were essentially white populists who hated the Democrats, and they would join forces with the Republicans. And together, they would become a political conglomerate. And I think they just went under the title of Fusionist. The Democrats hated the Fusionists, obviously, because they were a political rival. And eventually, the Democrat instigators were able to rile up the people in Wilmington, and they began to start so many problems that it came to the point where the red shirts started killing people in Wilmington. And they wanted to kill all the blacks in the city, and they began to kill the black people in the city, and the blacks, of course, fought back, and there was a little war in the city. Now, they began to say, well, it was a race war, and the blacks started it, et cetera, and it's like, no, actually, this was a situation that was completely instigated for the purpose of justifying a coup d'etat, and that's what the red shirts did. The red shirts did a coup. They overthrew Silas P. Wright, and they replaced him with a Democrat by the name of Alfred M. Waddell. We've been through this before, is what I'm trying to say. Political polarization, divisiveness. Now, we have not come to the point where we're having coup d'etats, right? We haven't come to that point yet, even though there were definitely people who stormed the Capitol who wanted to kill politicians, and there were people screaming, hang Mike Pence. It wasn't just Republicans versus Democrats, everyone. They were people screaming, hang Mike Pence, and they also hate Lindsey Graham. So before people start saying, well, you know, BLM was burning down property, or Antifa was burning down property, and liberals were doing property destruction, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's all true. But just to remind you guys, Mike Pence didn't support BLM, and Mike Pence sure as hell did not support Antifa's rioting. And they wanted to kill Mike Pence. So I'm not sure how much of this has to do with BLM, and I don't think a lot of this was even a response to what Antifa was doing. I think what we saw in the Capitol was merely a factionalism. That's what it was. It was like the Shiites versus the Sunnis, but American style. And what I hope that we don't do is return back to that historical violence of American history. But nonetheless, there are people in this country who do want to return to those days. There are people in this country who do want that. They want to go back to political factionalism. They want to go back to the violence, the political violence that was actually quite common in American history. They want to go back to that. And they're both, and I hate to sound like one of these centrist types, but it's true. They're both on the left and the right, these instigators. We have the lefties who destroy property. They will attack police officers. They will destroy a police precinct. They want to shoot and murder cops. And then you have the people on the right who are essentially fascists, or they're just radical populist, or they are jingoists, or just straight up Nazis. And they want to murder the politicians that they don't like. That's why we heard Steve Bannon say that he would like to behead Fauci, and I forgot the name of the other guy, but he wanted. Bannon says that he wants to behead one of the guys who was running the FBI. I forgot his name, but Bannon said that he would behead these two people and put their heads on different corners outside of the White House as a show of strength to instill fear in the hearts of Trump's political enemies. I mean, when I heard Bannon say that, it's like, and this guy was the political strategist for Trump's campaign. I mean, he was very close to the Trump camp. And Bannon is very influential, and he was running the biggest conservative website in the world, Breitbart. This is not like, I mean, we used to talk about these things like, these people are just on the fringes. They're just living in their grandparents' basement, on the forums. They're on the chans. Pay no attention to them. It's like, no. Now they're in government. Now they're influential. Now these people have not just influence within government, but they have influence at the metapolitical level. And what is the metapolitical level? What do I mean by that? The metapolitical level is the influence over the masses. These people have tremendous influence over a huge portion of the American population. This is serious. This is not like, there's just fringe groups. Like, no, these people are psychopaths. When we saw Stephen Miller, or Stephen Miller, there's a PH in the name, but when we saw Miller, who was an advisor for Donald Trump, when we saw Miller using articles from freaking Amrin, American Renaissance, to prove his position on immigration. I mean, for those of you who don't know, American Renaissance is one of the big racist organizations in the United States. They literally say on their website that eugenics is their goal. They literally say that's their objective. They want eugenics. They want Darwinism. They want racialist policies. When you see someone who was close to the Trump camp referencing Amrin, what does that reveal to you? This is like if someone was close to Obama and they were sending articles from some communist website. This is the right-wing equivalent to that. It's insanity. It's really creepy. It's crazy. It really is crazy. I just hope we don't return to that insanity. Last night I saw a movie, and I usually don't talk about film. Sometimes I do, but I do like talking about movies. I love watching movies, by the way. It's a huge guilty pleasure of mine. I love watching movies. I watch them not every week, but I watch them a lot. I love films, and I love watching low-budget horror movies and indie horror films, and it's very enjoyable for me. I love watching historical dramas, and I love watching movies. So I watched this film. I didn't hear about it until just a couple of weeks ago. It's called The Black Coat's Daughter. And The Black Coat's Daughter is a low-budget horror movie. It was presented to the public, I want to say, in 2017. And, there aren't a lot of good horror movies out there. Most of them are either boring or they're not very well executed. But I must say, The Black Coat's Daughter was a creepy movie. It puts you on the edge. At least that's what it did to me. And not to spoil too much of it, but the film is about a girl who ends up getting into the occult. And, okay, I will spoil some of the film, but not too much. She ends up murdering people and putting their heads on the floor as offerings to this spiritual entity that she starts following. And you're, it's just some hocus pocus stuff. This stuff actually happens. It's been happening for a long time. And then later on in the film, she gets so at that point she gets so addicted to this presence, this demonic presence, that she murders again later on in her life, with the hopes that this spirit would be summoned. And I watched the film, and I'm just looking for an excuse to talk about this film because I thought it was a well-done horror film. But nonetheless, I want to make a political metaphor out of this. I hope that's not what we are as a country. And generally speaking, I hope that the world isn't completely like this. I hope we don't summon the old demon back, the old demon of violence, of rage, of war, of sinisterism, of tribalism and jingoism and egoism. I hope we don't revive that which will pull us back into the abyss. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.